We are recording.
Hey, welcome to the first April interim meeting of the Transport Area Working Group. I'm David Black, one of your remote working group chairs.
I'm Gary Fairhurst. I'm also a remote working group chair.
And Wes Eddy.
So
Next
that
slide.
was Wes. And we have a new area director for this group, so that's Martin. Martin, are you online?
I'm here, and I'm happy to be here.
Excellent. This is Martin Duke. He's our new responsible AD. I like the word responsible there.
Little does he know what he just signed up for.
So if I weren't the responsible AD, would that make me the irresponsible AD?
That's the other one. We have the IETF note well, even though this is a rather odd way to perhaps go about doing IETF business. The IETF note well does apply, so make sure that you are familiar with it. Basically, it requires you to think carefully before you speak so that you consider IPR implications. If you already understand this, that's fine. If you don't, then look at this slide. This may help you understand what the implications are. There's some instructions here. You probably have seen at least a little bit of this because you've got this far. But the way in which we're going to run this is using multiple tools. We have the WebEx itself. We will be using the video feed to share a little bit of the presenters, and we will be showing the slides. In the chat room that goes with this, WebEx chat room, we will use primarily for managing the queue. So we don't wish to have discussions on that chat. Please use +Q, -Q to add yourself as you need. There will be the Jabber room. This will be monitored as best we can, and please use that. It's the meetings Jabber room. And there are some how-to notes available from the IETF Secretariat, so doing our best to support it. Next slide, I guess. Mute your mic when you don't need it, because that makes everything better for everyone else. We'll try and manage a queue in a IETF way of running a queue, in which case, please put +Q into the chat room in WebEx, and we will look for that, and we will ask you to speak if you're in that queue. Make sure you speak your full name. It's pretty difficult for us to find out who's speaking remotely, so please take a little bit of care just to explain who you are before you start, and we'll record the name in the meeting notes. Okay, next slide. We have a note taker, do we? Who is the note taker? Do we not have a note taker?
Note taker is muted. Yeah, it's Jake.
Yeah, okay. I thought it was going to be you, Jake, but need to make sure. We have someone in the Jabber session, so we should be able to use Jabber. And we are going to try and watch the queue. Other things you can help with. We're always looking for reviewers for working group drafts. We have a number of drafts that are coming up to a working group last call. Please look for these. Please review those. But please also take a chance to review any other documents you find being discussed or just appearing on the list. Reviews are what makes this process work. Please volunteer reviews. If you're in any doubt, contact one of the chairs and we'll help you. But we always appreciate people to review. If you're thinking about providing a draft to this working group, please ensure -TSVWG- appears in the draft name, and then we'll spot it in the tracker and we will call upon you. For the moment, we're going to focus at this meeting not on individuals' drafts, but on the main working group items, because it makes it slightly simpler to run the interim, and we need to focus on getting the working group items moving towards completion. Next slide, please. Now, David, do you want to talk about the ones you shepherded?
So speaking of completed working group items, we now have 3 RFCs on the extensions to the forward error correction framework to accommodate the RLC coding. RFC numbers are there. Vincent has been very patient. It's been a long adventure. They're out. Let's see, that gobbledygook in the middle of the slide is announcing that the infamous WebRTC cluster 238 is about to enter auth 48, which means our one draft as part of that cluster and has been lingering in the RFC editor queue is going to pop out and get published sometime soon. Beyond that, we don't yet have any more net drafts in RFC editor queue, but we're about to start working on changing that. Slide. Okay. Datagram PMTUD is in IESG review. The 3 IDs with working group chairs and authors after working group last call are all mine for some reason. The first 2 drafts, ECN encapsulation for lower layer protocols and ECN for tunnels that use shim headers. We have rough consensus on the list as to what the fragmentation text needs to say. Bob needs to find the copious spare time to write it. I need to find the copious spare time to review it. The drafts will be revised. The crucial thing is these drafts have to align with RFC 3168 ECN requirements on reassembly, and then we can separately decide whether we want to rev 3168 to improve that. This should be a text exercise. Transfer confidentiality impacts. Yours truly, as Shepherd, thinks we are getting close to done with the text bashing. With luck, we're going to have one more rev of this draft that will finally bash the text, insert the mentions of whatever else needs to be mentioned, and then I will write up the Shepherd report and make this Martin's problem. Next slide.
Are we talking about this?
The transfer confidentiality, we're not going to talk about it here. I prefer that the detailed text bashing continue on the list. I believe we're down to fairly low level text bashing.
I don't agree with that characterization.
Who's speaking?
This is Eric Rescorla.
Understood. And Eric, what's going to happen is that your objection to publication of this draft will be included explicitly in the Shepherd report. Please raise it again at IETF last call. That will be the place to deal with it.
If that's how you want to roll.
That is how I want to roll. Rough consensus occasionally requires calling people in the rough. Sorry to have to do it to you.
Okay, I don't agree with your call of rough consensus, but I suppose you can take it at IETF last call.
It's going to. I would prefer that issue be bashed at IETF last call, please. Okay, next slide.
Do a consensus call, actually? No, I'm sorry to be difficult, but are you actually going to do a consensus call on this and take yeses or nos? Because I haven't seen you do that. It's just our objection to raised.
Do an announcement to the list of what's going to go into the the Shepherd report, which includes sending your views on the draft and David Skenazy's views on the draft to IETF last call, which I think is the more appropriate form to work those out.
I guess I don't agree with that process. The right appropriate process is to actually run a poll.
That seems to run afoul of the we don't do voting.
I guess we can take it off offline, but I don't agree. That's not how it seems to run it.
Okay, happy take it offline. I believe the appropriate form to continue on those concerns is IETF last call. I believe there's working group consensus to do so. Okay, Gore, you want to cover RTO consider?
Yeah, I can cover RTO Consider. RTO Consider is TCPM work item. It's about architecting the RTO timer in TCP, but has evolved to give wider guidance on setting backstop timers in transport protocols in general. So this TCPM work item is relevant here. We worked with Mark Holman, the main author, when we did the UDP guidelines some while ago. So the working group has already published a document that is supposed to be consistent with this more detailed document. I would recommend that you read it. Please send discussion of this to TCPM. It's a joint working group last call, and they would love to hear feedback. Next one, IDs likely to go to working group last call soon. We'll hear a bit about these later. We have two drafts which have been around for quite a while relating to SCTP. One has been around for as long as I can remember, which is the NAT support document. And I believe that's pretty near finished now. Expect a working group last call of that very soon. There's also the SCTP base update. This is mainly an update of the text of the spec to include the errata. It's not intended as a major change to SCTP in any way. Please review it with that thinking that this is not intended to be a major change, but it is an important time to clean up the spec and complete the wording in there so that it's a good solid spec. There are comments still to be put into the next rev, and then we'll do a working group last call of that. When we come to those two items in the meeting shortly, I'll be asking for people to volunteer to review these. The L4S drafts are going to be discussed in the second interim meeting, so we'll come to those later rather than today. Next slide. These then are the list of working group IDs which are currently with the working group. NAT support, SCTP base spec, the 3 L4S drafts, the non-queue building PHB draft, UDP options, and the tunnel congestion feedback. There are a number of individual drafts which are mentioned on this slide. In fact, there are more than this, but this just calls out some of those individual drafts which are waiting currently in the sidelines to enter TSVWG. Feel free to comment on any of these on the list. Use the list to talk about them. We're interested in hearing on your thoughts on these drafts. There are two drafts at the top which I'd like to just call out. The SOX protocol is an int area document. As far as I know, it's proceeding in int area in the absence of the Vancouver meeting. At some point, this will be a working group last called with this working group because SOX is something that is not just int area. It's the binding between the int area and putting two int area pipes together. So it's something that's relevant to TSVWG. And they're looking to us for the transport clue to review that document. The second document, the reassignment of system ports to the IESG, is a non-working group internet draft. It was put forward to propose changes to the IANA process for the system ports. As it went through the IETF last call process, a number of different things appeared, and this document is going to be recycled and revised and a decision made on the document to proceed. It's not a TSVWG work item, but it is close to some of the stuff that TSVWG has done in the past. So it may be useful to read the next revision of this draft and give feedback to the authors, please.
I see Bob in the mic queue. Bob, what did you want to comment on?
Talking on mute. I just wanted to ask on the previous slide that I noticed tunnel congestion feedback. What's happening to it? It doesn't seem to have been updated for ages. Is it still alive? Are the authors still alive?
It's still alive. It's going to be used by an SFC draft, and last time I was paying attention, it was pretty much on hold for that SFC draft to make progress.
Okay.
So, to be revived, I think, is a fair summary. Rory, I think you're on mute now.
Yeah, it's good to be on mute. We've been working through our revised working group milestone. Top one is in red. It should have happened. We just heard about. We will hear about that shortly. The next one is the April 2020 for the header encryption and confidentiality. This is one that's probably ready to progress to the next level of review. PLP-MTUD has been submitted to the IESG and should be on the telechat tomorrow. SCTP-NAT due to be finished in April. We may finish this in April and make a working group last call for that. Next up will be Joe's work on transport options for UDP. This is something that Joe's revising. I'm not aware that Joe is going to make a presentation at the meeting. He is about to put in a set of revisions to deal with a queue of things that have been asked since the last IETF, and he'll produce a new revised ID. So I don't know whether we'll meet the June deadline or not, but certainly by June, the thing should be in a pretty good shape. Next one was one of yours, David. Do you want to comment on
what's
that?
going to happen? Yeah, what's happening here is for some reason, we accidentally got the milestones separated. In practice, the draft at the top of the screen, the easing encapsulation guidelines, and the draft at the bottom, the 6040 update, are paired, and they will be revised together and sent off to the IESG together. Next month or so, all other things permitting.
Okay, next slide. This is it. Okay, milestones 2. The FTTP BIS protocol we'll hear about. We think that's in good shape. The 3 L4S drafts have a targeted milestone of October 2020, and the NQB PHB is a little bit further out. That might actually be finished early. It's been nice to be finished early. The bottom one, I don't really have hope at the moment of finishing early. It's still a work in progress. Next slide. So this is the agenda we've put together for our remote meeting that we're currently in. Now is the time to say if you want to add something to this agenda or you think there's something missing. We've done the note well. We've done most of our announcements and heads up. We're going to say a little bit about the plan for the second interim. I expect that to be Wes. Hopefully he does too. We then go to the SCTP drafts, the transport working group drafts on protocols, and a couple of individual drafts that are looking for some guidance by the working group. These 2 drafts need a home. So we'll be interested in knowing your views on whether they're interesting material to work upon. We don't have on the agenda Bob's slide deck. I slipped it in as 2.1 in the meeting materials. Do we want to show that, other chairs?
Yeah, I'm fine if Bob wants to show that. We can hand the presentation all over to him.
Okay, is that the last slide of our, so we want to do the next agenda slide, I think? This is the agenda for the second interim. This is a little bit further out, and the interim's on Monday, the 27th of April. And we're going to focus this particular interim just on the L4S and ECN topic, particularly focusing in on ECT1 usage. We've prepared an example set of slides for this, which we're going to use to get contributions from the L4S advocates and the SCE advocates. And we're going to put together a joint presentation in which we will expect the different parties to each present their own position, and we'll then be able to hopefully ask for some working group feedback on what to do next, on trying to agree the decisions that we need to make, and then perhaps trying to make some of those decisions. The chair's summary of position is the hope at the end that we actually get somewhere with the ongoing discussion that's been had in the working group. Is there anything else you want to add to that, David?
No, wish us well.
Okay, so recap. If you haven't yet done so, there are blue sheets available in Etherpad. Please make sure you do sign in. If you can use Jabber, we can use Jabber for remote chat. I see some Jabber going on in the main WebEx chat because more people are joined there. We'll try and make this work. If you do want to talk at the mic, make sure you put +Q into the main WebEx chat. I think that's our last slide. Bob, would you like to prepare a short update of your shim slides? Just take a few minutes just to take us quickly through that.
I can do that, yeah. Just tells people what the status is, yeah.
Bob, do you want to present the slides? I can make you a presenter.
Probably best not, as I'm on a limping broadband link via my mobile phone via a strange mast and various other things.
Sure.
I uploaded them in the proceedings.
Thanks. I did copy the link to the list, so if people can't have am I meant to be able to see them yet? Or was they?
Wes, can you remote present?
I do not have easy access to a copy of them. So
Okay.
I'm working on it. Give me 30 seconds.
okay, I will make you the presenter in the meantime.
Okay. See if work. That
Put a link to the slides in the chat.
okay. If I've done this right, you see Bob's first slide.
Yep. Good. Okay. So there's really two drafts that this affects, and it was a comment from Joe Touch during the working group last call to say, what about fragmentation and reassembly in tunnels? The drafts are primarily about tunnels, not fragmentation and reassembly. And as David has pointed out, and I've pointed out, the two are often come together, but they're orthogonal. So anyway, next slide, please, Wes. So the top level point here is that RFC 3168 already mentions what to do about reassembly, and essentially aims to preserve the time of each CCN mark. As you see here, there's an attempt to show 8 fragments being turned into 4 packets, and the red crosses are meant to be ECN marks. And if either or both of the fragments have an ECN mark, the resulting packet is meant to have one. as per 3168. And the logic behind that was to attempt to preserve the time. And Jonathan in particular has been arguing that AQM's light coddle control the time between marks, and that's why that's correct. And the argument I've been putting with, and I've got a couple of examples to show it, is that coddle doesn't aim for a specific time between marks, it just uses time, and then it adjusts the time until it balances. And so there's no it's no particularly different process to adjusting probability. It just adjusts a thing, and it happens to use time. And so the actual time between the marks isn't special. And actually, as you'll see in the next example, it causes unfairness to try and preserve the mark time between the marks. I'm gonna.
At the time
Sorry, David.
RFC 3168 was written, the primary goal was not to lose congestion marks.
Yes, yes, and preserving the time when they happen is another way of saying not losing them. Yep. I'm going to get to the end of how this affects these drafts, but I just wanted to give some background to what the debate is. So this is the first example. The top shows a couple of sources and destinations, in other words, of two flows going through, as it happens, a tunnel, but this could just be fragmentation generally. And this tunnel happens to have an MTU of 1500 bytes. One flow is running just below that, so that when the headers are added, it doesn't need to fragment. The other is running at 1500 bytes, so when the headers are added, it does need to fragment. And in this case, it's a V4 tunnel, so it's the tunnel is fragmenting. So you end up with twice as many packets in the lower flow. I'm looking at the top picture, top half of this picture. So with a certain percentage marking, say 0.2%, over 1,000 packets per second, you get 4 marks per second for the second flow. That means, and the way 3168 does the reassembly, we're assuming this is 3168 reassembly, that means you end up with twice as many marks coming out the other end, even though you've got the same packet rate once you put all the fragments back together into packets. Then the lower half shows that TCP will respond to those, and it will end up going about a quarter of the rate of the other flow. So that looks like it's a problem, and it comes from this idea that you need to preserve all the marks. If I now show the second example, this one uses a FQ scheduler as the AQM. So this time it forces the flows to all have the same rate, and because the scheduler forces that, and so effectively TCP reverse engineers the percentage marking AQM in the FQ scheduler to make sure that they all have equal rate. And I've shown 3 flows here, A, B, and C, and one of them, or the top one, is, as on the previous slide, slightly smaller than 1500 bytes. The second one is the 1500 byte one that we had before, which gets fragmented. And the third one is a source that already makes its packets half the size of 1500 bytes, in other words, 750 bytes. So they don't need to be fragmented. And the top level point about this, without going all the way through it, is that it ends up that the FQ scheduler marks the time between the marks depends on just what effectively what TCP is doing. So it adjusts until it gets the right time between the marks to make all the flow rates equal, but none of the times between marks, well, 2 of the times between marks are equal and 1 isn't. And in particular, when you look at the last 2, the red words there, you've got one mark every 1.7 seconds in one and one mark every 6.7 seconds in the other, and yet they're both 2,000 packets per second. They're both 750 bytes, and the AQM doesn't actually know that one of those the packets are fragments and the others aren't. It never looks at whether they're fragments or not. It's just marking packets that happen to be inside a tunnel. So that looks like something seriously wrong. So the upshot of that is we've got to sort that out. So what we'll do in these this update shim draft and the ECN NCAP guidelines draft is just say that fragmentation and reassembly is out of scope. These are about tunneling, and fragmentation and reassembly is orthogonal to that. We will mention that 3168 discusses ECM fragmentation and reassembly, but we won't give it as a normative reference. It'll be an informative reference, and we'll update 3168 fragmentation and reassembly separately if, and that will be a draft that has to be adopted and all the rest of it, and it'll be a short one if it is, to update 3168 as a probably standards track draft. And that's it.
Okay, cool. Alrighty.
Is that the process you believe, David?
I believe that's a process, and I believe that we've pretty much agreed on slightly longer descriptions of the mention RFC 3168 discusses ECN frag and reassembly text on the list. It's a little bit tricky to write because you essentially want to say that if you want to figure out how to do it now, go see 3168. We want to do that without using a must or should keyword, given that we're going to get to debate that in the context of that separate short draft and last bullet of the slide. But that's the plan. We think it works.
Yep.
Okay.
So Bob, presumably you're also going to, Gary here. So Bob, presumably you're going to also pay some attention to the inter-area documents by Ron Bonica, etc., that talk about fragmentation and whether it's a good idea in the first place.
I think those documents become important in the context of the separate. we get to debate this all in the context of the next draft, for which we don't even have a -00 yet. Jonathan, and hopefully last comment, because we need to move on to the rest of the agenda. Oh, he just DQ'd himself. That's even easier. All right. What is next, gentlemen? Ladies and gentlemen.
SCTP,
CTP,
Michael
yes.
Dixon. Are you around, Michael? Michael, are you in the room? Excellent. Would you like to take the floor and tell us about SCTP BIS? Yes.
What has to be done still? Reviewed the document and provided a list of issues, which are, well, editorials might be not the right term, but look at text changes, something like that, in a detailed way. So I have to go through this and address these. Most likely, I will put in a revision when that's done. And then another format change has to happen. Originally, 4960 was written in XML. The ROC editor changed it back to NROF. When I got it for the BIS, I converted NROF to V2 of the XML in a very strange way to preserve the NROF formatting, and then it will be reformatted to V3, and I will take out all the hacks to make it look like NROF stuff. So that should be done, and then I guess you will see formatting and whitespace changes. So the div tool on the text will not be very nice to look at, and to address any other further comments. So that's the plan for that document.
Sounds good. Michael, quick check. Do you have a short summary of changes from 4960 in this draft?
No, we have a whole RFC about this. It's the SCTP errata, which is old style, new style. Old text, new text. It describes exactly the changes between 4960 and 4960 BIS.
Understood. It might be helpful to implementers to have a TLDR summary in this draft of important stuff that has changed.
I guess that those important changes are really DPLP, MTUD, and a couple of erratas that occurred since we did that other document. So this should be very short.
Yes. I'm thinking of if you're an implementer and want to understand in 30 seconds how this draft matters to your 4960 implementation. Here are the top 3, 5, whatever things you need to know.
Including the changes from the errata RFC.
Yeah, including that as a pointer, Mark. I don't think, Michael, I'm expecting.
Oh, okay.
You paste that in. So I'm expecting a very small section somewhere which says the changes between 4960 base and this are documented here in this RFC. Additionally, there are 2 bullets, 3 bullets, whatever, of changes.
Okay, understood.
I would also put in perhaps 3 or 4 bullets of the errata changes that actually affect implementations as opposed to the ones that were just text cleanup.
They all have erratas, I think, David.
I understand they're all errata. It's just that the errata RFC is enormous, and I'm looking for a real short summary of if you're an implementer and you're trying to update from 4960 to this BIS RFC, what are the top things you need to pay attention to?
Okay, I guess I'll work with Michael and we'll sort this.
It's not.
Okay.
It shouldn't be a lot of work.
My list of comments on the work in progress line are, just for complete transparency, is going through every use of an RFC 2119 keyword and checking that the text there is completely watertight. A couple of places there are its and theys that refer to other parts of the document, which I just wanted to tone and make sure that they were completely clear. So I suspect this shouldn't raise questions, but if they do, I guess Michael will discuss them on the list as usual.
Yep, we do.
When do you think you can do my long list of checks and your conversion from V2 to V3 and have the whole thing ready for the last call?
By the next IETF, if it happens. I mean, what is it? End of July, or what is the time frame there? I mean, the time frame for the next IETF, that would be, I guess, when we have that ready.
That sounds good. And by that time, we will need reviewers for this document. So if you're a person who's been reading this, as soon as Michael posts the V2 to V3 conversion, we'd love people to go through and find column, and we'd love people to volunteer to do that in the working group last call. So as soon as that second revision is published, we're looking for people to read that text and check it in detail. Any other questions to this draft? Then you get to talk about NUT.
Yes, next slide. So the revision 15 was the revision which the authors thought that the document is ready. There came up the suggestion to include a Yang module, and that was provided by Mohammed, and it was included. The XML sources were converted from V2 to V3, so I used this document as an exercise to do this conversion. And we had some comments from Maxim, a lot of comments from Maxim. I tried to address them, and the result is revision 16. Next slide. So this is the current state. We have editorial comments from Gori, which are fine. So it's no discussion required. Maxim we have reduced the number of issues he has with this document. We have one issue where Maxim wants something else as it is written in the document, and it's about if we have a net and we have two clients behind the net establishing an association to the same server using the same port. And there is a collision in port numbers and the verification tag. Then the current document says the netbox must send an abort to the client, such that, and it's indicating that this abort comes from the middle box, and it indicates why it's the case. So the SCDP stack can by itself reissue a new init with a new verification tag and hopefully resolve this collision. Maxim wants that the must, which is now there, becomes a should, because he wants to build nets in a simpler way, basically in a way that they don't need to send packets. So the drawback is that in this case, the net would just drop the packet. The end node would have to run into timeouts multiple times. And then what the stack does is give an indication to the application, and then the application has to re-trigger another association setup. And that's something I don't like. So that's the technical thing. Any preferences there? So I would like to make the life most simple for the application. He wants to allow this for a net, and if I'm an application and I don't know what the net does, I have to deal with the timeouts. So any comments on that?
Sorry, I've got a couple of comments. What do any implementations of this nut do?
I know one implementation, and I guess that is doing send the abort.
That sends the abort. Yeah, I thought so.
That implementation follows that implementation is built based on this specification, so that's why it doesn't.
Yeah. What does anybody in the working group have opinions on this?
This is David. I have a question. What happens if the NAT sends the abort and the abort is dropped?
Then the endpoint retransmits the init, and it triggers another abort. And if that is dropped again and again and again after 10 times, the association goes down.
But I suggest you write up roughly what you just described in terms of what the implementation is going to have to do if the abort is dropped or if the abort is repeatedly dropped. And then in that context, we might be able to take a sharper look at whether sending the abort is a must or a should.
I would actually support David's line of thinking and suggest you propose to the working group some text which says, if this is a should, this is the reason why you should do it. I'm a little bit interested in looking at both options here, because having a must for something which doesn't require the protocol mechanism to retransmit it from the NAT isn't reliable, so the must isn't really that helpful, because you inject a packet that may or may not finally reach the endpoint.
Yeah, I want to see how bad the downside is before I weigh in on must versus should. And I think though we're sort of in some form of rough agreement that writing up the downside of the abort not arriving is important to do.
Okay, I will do that. The other comments are editorial, and I can resolve them with Maxim. Mohammed also has not only suggested the Yang model, he also suggested some comment. He also had some comments. Most of them have been integrated. Two are not integrated yet. And one is, I also need some sort of advice. We talk about net devices in that document. And this is done in RFC 2663 and RFC 4787. Mohammed suggests to use net function because that's the term used in RFC 6888. And there are even other documents which use simply net. in the sense of, so being an acronym not for network address translation, but using it as an acronym for network address translator. So what should we do? I don't care. I
would suggest sticking with NAT device and then putting the explanation you just gave about other terminology being used in other places into the draft and saying we're using NAT device because we needed a term here.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yep. Call it out explicitly early. Just say, in this document, we talk about a NAT device. Other places might talk simply about a NAT, or implement this as a NAT function and cite the appropriate RFC for NAT function.
Okay. Matt
is in the queue. That would be good to hear.
Yeah.
Actually, I personally, I don't care. I don't have any. I would say it's the comment is really minor. You just pick the one which is, I would say, your favorite one, and then to be consistent with the, I would say, through the document. It will just go to, I would say, the use of device is that for people will implicitly mention that is something which is really, I would say, hardware. Why we are mainly dealing with I would say, with the software component. That's the initial comment. But more basically, actually, one of the comments they would like that you would cover, I would say, in the new version was about the fragmentation, because, for instance, in your document, you mandate to have, I would say, the fragmentation to be must be, I would say, the reassembly must be supported by the NAT device itself. This is not something that we have today for all the, I would say, the NAT flavors we have in the field, with only one exception about the NAT64, which requires to do the reassembly. So I think that's, you need to have more discussion on that part to have the implication of having the, I would say, the NAT function itself to do the assembly, how the memory will be, I would say, controlled, etc. There's a lot of, I would say, complications to do that on the device, the checksum configuration and so on. So I would say, so the fragmentation for me is more important than the, I would say, the terminology one. So I would like you that if this is possible, that you can cover that in the next version with more attention.
I can try to. Okay.
So Michael or Med or whoever, what should we do with fragmented packets? SCTP kind of expects the IP layer to help with its fragmentation. It's one of the functions in the SCTP spec. So we could write and explain that this is something that's important, or you could just allow a NAT to break and not send these packets, in which case you will get datagram drops. Is that what we're talking about?
So if I get if a NAT box gets a packet, it gets a fragment, and has to make the decision to which internal node it's being forwarded, it must look up the association. So that's why we currently say it must do reassembly, and then it knows what to do, and then it can process it.
So I guess the question to you, Michael, is what happens if the NAT is a small device or a function which is limited in terms of its memory and doesn't want to do that sort of reassembly work? Do we just say this can't implement the spec?
Well, it can implement the spec, but if for whatever reason SCTP has to fragment packets or some other node fragments the packets, they are dropped, and in some scenarios, SCTP can't recover from that. So there are scenarios where SCTP relies on IP fragmentation and reassembly to be working.
I think this is
This is another chunk of functionality that simply needs to be explained. That if you don't do this, the following bad things happen.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay. Magnus. Thank you.
Yeah, Magnus Westlund. I just wonder, how does this relate to actually PathMTU discovery requirements?
Yeah, it's okay. If you do PathMTU, Michael can answer this. Why am I talking?
Yeah, so PathMTU discovery helps you to if the MTU drops, you will figure that out and you will adopt. But in SCTP, if you have sent a packet which is larger than the path MTU, because, for example, the path MTU was for some reason shrank, SCTP might not be able to re-fragment to rebuild the packet in a smaller way. So then it relies on a small amount of time for fragmentation and reassembly to work. Once it has learned that the MTU went down, it adopts the packet construction to that, but it can't, for example, if a user message is broken up in data chunks, it can't redo this.
Okay. Problematic then, yeah. Okay, then I have no more input ethics.
Okay, next slide. And that's already resolved. So Mohamed also wanted that we don't use public address for the address on the external side of the net. We use external side, and then we change the terminology for the other endpoint from external to remote. And that's consistent, and he's fine with it, and so I will change that. So that's the stuff which has to change in the document, and plus the IP fragmentation thing, plus the must versus should.
Terminology change. This terminology change is good.
Okay. That's all I have.
Thank you. When might you be able to do all this again? In the next shorter period or longer period?
Let me try to do it within the next 4 weeks.
Excellent. I like that a lot. Thank you. Greg, would you like to talk about NQB?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Great. This is a brief update on the status of the NQB draft. You can go on to the next slide. So the status, just the recent history is this draft was adopted by the working group shortly after IETF 105. And my co-author and I published the draft 00 in November last year with some really significant restructuring of the draft from the original draft, individual draft into a format that is closer to the format of other PHB specs. And also in the process addressed most of the comments that had been made during the IETF 105 meeting and on the mailing list around that time. There was one set of comments that we didn't tackle on that draft 00, which was relating to interoperability with Wi-Fi, and particularly Wi-Fi multimedia or EDCA. And that was work that then followed after draft 0. So draft 1, which we just published, I guess about a month ago now, rewrote that Wi-Fi interoperability section, introduced some new requirements to provide safeguards. There were some concerns were around the potential for in Wi-Fi, the NQB code point to be treated in a way that's not that doesn't comply with the PHB requirements. So it actually gives it priority over best effort or default code point, which was the NQB draft has a requirement of not introducing a priority difference between the two. And so a number of safeguards were added into the Wi-Fi section and some recommendations on configuration of EDCA in order to eliminate that those issues. There are also a few editorial changes that we took care of in draft 01. But that's now been published for a month, so hopefully folks have had a chance to look at that. And if the Wi-Fi interoperability concern was one that you had, please take a look at that newly rewritten section and let us know if you have any comments or suggestions on that. Remaining work to do. A couple of items relating to detail in the draft around operation in certain situations. So first one being existing DSCP remarking pathologies. There have been some studies in the not too distant past about ways that diff-cert code points are manipulated or mangled in transit, and not in the kind of common way of just bleaching to zero, but actually modification of particular bits in the diff-cert field. And so some discussion of the potential impact that might have on NQB treatment is needed. Secondly, there are a number of shoulds in the draft, and we don't provide much detail on with the ramifications of not complying with those shoulds. I think a couple of them we do, but several of them we don't. So a little bit of work there. And then lastly, on the slide here, further alignment with PHB spec guidelines provided in RFCs 2474, 2475. I've got a little bit of detail on the next slide that shows what's left to do on that.
Before you go to the next slide, Greg, this is David. One more work item, which I'm going to assign to myself as shepherd, and that is this would be a good time, since we're approaching completion, to recheck the selection of the default DSCP for this PHB, and that I think that's my responsibility as shepherd to kick that discussion off on the list.
Okay, thank you. One other item actually that I didn't make into the slide is there's still a question of should versus must on one of the requirements, and that's the requirement for traffic protection, or what we originally called queue protection. So some further discussion needs to happen to finalize that one.
Yeah, in particular, that one's going to be a bifurcated, well, sorry, not bifurcated. It's going to be a two-part discussion, because it's going to have to talk about both what is the requirement for implementation and what is the requirement the requirement for usage. I have an opinion on this, and I will refrain from diving into that rat hole right now.
Okay. All right, I appreciate that. Thank you. So next slide then. So I went through the guidelines in RFC 2475. 2474 also had some guidelines, but they were fairly high level, and I think largely covered by the more detailed set in 2475. So I listed them out here. Many of these we, I think, have already taken care of. There are three I highlighted that we definitely need to do some work on. And then there are a few that are close, but maybe don't exactly comply with the expectations, like, for example, putting things into appendices rather than having them in the main body of the draft.
David, again, on G11, config management issues, traffic protection, configuration management definitely is part of that.
All right, noted. And that is it for my update. So we do plan to continue work on the draft and ideally have it in good shape for transitioning to working with blast call fairly soon, hopefully by the next IETF meeting.
Sounds good. Any other comments or questions?
Is Magnus still in the queue?
I think Magnus said his bid on the earlier topics. I think we're moving on.
Okay. From my point of view, I'd be interested in picking out the diff-serv code point selection as a separate topic on the email list, and let's try and confirm that we've got the right diff-serv code point and it works in the right way. it seems like something that's orthogonal to the specification of the PHP, so we could probably separately call that out on the list, just get some people to see whether we all agree with the analysis, and then perhaps even we can provisionally allocate that DSCP to this document.
I agree. I need to start that discussion.
That'd be good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now move to Martin. Martin, would you like to change your hat and join us in the blue box on the floor?
I think.
I'm probably guilty for bringing this here, so I'll do a little bit of a prelude. This working group used to not do NAT stuff because we had a Behave working group. Then the Behave working group did the clever thing of closing and asking where did all the work go, and the answer was the work came to TSVWG, which is fine. Then suddenly we end up with a new transport. So do we need a document about Quick and how it works with relation to the Behave documents? Do we need guidance for this? Should it be done here? Should it be done somewhere else? I guess that's what we're now going to hear about. Over to you, Martin.
Yes, good morning or afternoon, everyone. This is a very short document that actually, as Gordy suggests, was originated in a discussion that we had, I think, in Singapore. Next slide. It's very short, and this is the even shorter version of it. Basically, if you were a NAT designer and you see this connection ID thing, it might sound cool to leverage that in some way, but in fact, that's bad. So just treat it like a UDP connection. Next slide. This is one example of a superficially attractive thing. If you are facing port exhaustion, you could, in theory, multiplex multiple quick connections over the same address port combination by just using the CID. Unfortunately, the CID can change in mid-connection through message exchange inside the crypto, which the NAT can't see, and then you would just black hole the connection, which is obviously not good. Far better to just refuse the connection in the first place than to create a black hole in mid flow. Next slide. So going the other side, one thing that we are facing in Quick community is that some routing architectures and data centers route based on the 5-tuple, so that if there's any sort of address change, whether it be a NAT rebinding or a intentional migration, the packet will end up at some other server. So there's a lot of work to kind of solve this problem. One thing, someone might try to be quote unquote helpful and have the NAT monitor the connection IDs, and then if there is a NAT rebinding that changes the address, simply rewrite the source address to allow it to route correctly back to the correct server. Well, number one, this won't work if the connection ID changes, so it eliminates the intentional migration case. And secondly, when there is any sort of address report change, there's a whole process to validate that it's accurate, that is in fact something that there's an actual change in the address of the client and not some sort of hijack attempt. And all those mechanisms occur in the crypto. And if you mask that from the end server, then it's not going to be able to perform all those checks. That's kind of creating a security vulnerability. Next slide. So this has not received a ton of review. It's sitting as an individual draft in Quick. I'm not, frankly, desperate for this to make it up to RFC or what have you. I think there's a number of possible outcomes. We could take this text and just put it in the Quick operations draft. The Quick operations draft is fairly mature. It's also quite long. And I think one of the objections to doing that is that people don't read long documents. Another option would be just to have this thing live forever as an expired individual draft and have the Quick ops draft just link to it as an informational reference for some background. Just put in the TLDR version in the ops draft and point to this for further discussion. We could make it a standalone RFC if people have the energy for that, or we could just drop this because it's just not particularly important thing to document. So again, I'm open to reviews and I'm open to input on what we should do with this.
Borrowing a phrase often used by the AD whose seat you have taken, it sounds like the overall purpose here is to prevent the bad idea fairy from visiting NAT implementers. And a standalone published RFC would be a good step in that direction.
Mira, you're next in queue, I think.
Yeah, I think we should definitely, no matter what happens to this document, add something to the manageability draft quick and point to this document. At that point, I don't really care about anymore if this is an own RFC or just an expired draft. I'm also fine having it in an own RFC, but it should definitely be mentioned in the manageability draft.
I think you're right. I think the manageability document has to include this. Then the question is whether David's comment is something that's important. In other words, will the NAT implementers read something short and go, aha, we won't do that because that's a really bad idea. Interesting. Okay. Colin?
I'm convinced that NAT implementers will necessarily read this, but I think we should write it anyway. Because I think it's important to document what the right thing to do is, whether or not it has a whole lot of effect in practice. I would also suggest that this includes some quite clear statement to remind people that not all UDP traffic is quick, and that's that they should be aware that there are other types of UDP traffic still.
Sounds interesting. Spencer?
We're back around to me, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm +1 on the short standalone document. I think that's the right thing to do. I'm +1 on RFC because I agree with the statement that was made that the NAT vendors aren't going to read this, but the NAT vendors are not the primary intended audience, in my opinion. It's people who would be showing this to NAT vendors, who are the opposite of NAT vendors, and +1 on the mention of an ops area of the ops management draft mentioning this. So I think that you were all queued up to do the right thing.
It should be written in the style of what is sometimes colloquially referred to as a clue by 4.
Exactly. I had not thought about what Colin said about reminding people that not all UDP traffic is quick traffic. I think that's a really good idea, and I think that will even be a really good idea if that's not true at some point in the future. Thank you.
So, Martin, you got some feedback from the working group, which sounded quite positive.
Yep.
There's a couple of questions now which you have to kind of figure out. The first one is you need to talk to the AD responsible for TSVWG to figure out whether it fits.
It's kind of difficult. I don't know how it's going to go.
Have to talk to the irresponsible lady for TSP working group.
That's probably wiser. Yeah.
I mean, I would expect if this. Go ahead.
I was just saying, here we go.
Okay, thank you. If this goes ahead, I will give you the cautionary tale since I'm currently wearing the hat. We will have to coordinate closely with Quick. So it's not a matter of where you do this and we ignore the other one. So it will have to be something that either the AD makes 2 chairs talk with together, or the two chairs start talking. So tell us what you would like to do next, Martin.
Well, I think the feedback has been pretty uniform. So I will pursue this. I'll have a chat with Magnus about which working group this best lives in between Quick and here. And I will take the comment, and then Mira and I can work on just getting a reference into the Quick Ops draft. I mean, for the moment, we'll point to this ID, and we'll see where it goes from there.
And we'll need to work
whatever
with.
happens, please feel free to prod TSVWG for the extra inputs and other UDP traffic.
Okay.
And as this moves, if this moves forward in TSVWG, the TSVWG chairs will need to coordinate with the Quick chairs. I don't know that I saw any of the Quick chairs on the on the list. So somebody probably needs to give them a heads up that we had this discussion. Martin, I think that might be you.
Okay.
That's fine. Thank you ever so much for an exciting talk. Next talk will be, Jerome. Jerome, are you online?
And I am, although I'm through 15 mute buttons.
Okay, maybe David could introduce the topic a little bit, because this has a little bit of history with it, which probably should prelude your speaking, and then go ahead after David's given an intro.
Okay, so this draft has been floating around for a while now. It's on version 2. 3GPP had a very negative reaction to this when it first appeared. We've had some discussions with some of the 3GPP folks, and I think their view is no longer quite as negative, although we're still not, at least speaking as a chair, I think not yet sure exactly what the purpose of this is and how to position it. And I believe the value of this draft, intended audience, who's supposed to use it, how does it relate to the 3GPP standards, is going to be the focus of what Jerome's going to talk about.
All right.
Jerome?
Thank you, David. Next slide, please. Thank you. So let me give a little bit more context, because yeah, indeed, this is important, and you will see on next slide why the first welcome was a bit cold on this draft. What we're looking at here is a case which starts to be emerging, where a UE, a device, may have two concurrent paths through a network. One going through the 3GPP realms, that's LTE, 5G, etc., you name it. And the other one is going through an unlicensed type of network, which is typically relying on deep serve. So that could be, for example, a Wi-Fi connection. What we see from implementers, and those are not carriers, and I think that's what was not clear in the first draft, but they're rather enterprises implementing a dual path for their devices, is that there is no clear translation of the SLA and the intent that is expressed well with the negotiation they have with their carriers to the intent that could be expressed to translate the same type of treatment over the deep serve domain. So in other words, you have some traffic going through the 3GPP domain, and typically what happens there is that there is a dialogue between an enterprise and a carrier by which they agree upon a certain type of treatment for a certain type of traffic and a certain type of devices. That is taken care of. But then if those devices have two connections, one, for example, going also to Wi-Fi, what we see is that those implementers, those enterprises, would like to, as much as possible, attempt to apply the same type of treatment, QoS treatment, on the leg that's going through the deep serve domain, or the bottom leg that you see on the screen here, so that there is a higher chance that when this traffic reaches the enterprise or the cloud application that the enterprise is using, those two legs perform in ways that are somehow somewhat comparable. And this is difficult because the 3GPP logic uses a system which is relying on structure like QCI, QFI, 5QI, depending on the generation you talk about, which is much richer, I must say, that than the DSCP values that we use, based on RC4594, for example. So what we attempt to do in this draft is to offer mapping structure that could allow those implementers to look at the QCI and say, oh, QCI blah seems to be matching intent blah, and this in DiffServ seems to be matching what we could use as marking blah, the SCP value X, Y, Z. As a matter of fact, we find that in many cases, those QCIs are new enough that in the DiffServ domain, we don't have the equivalent. So what we did there was to try to create a structure of mapping whenever possible, and whenever not possible, conclude that the implementers would have to implement in the DiffServ domain probably some markings that would be new, concluding that there is no clear mapping that could be used from this QCI logic into DiffServ logic. Next slide, please. So what we did initially in this draft 0 and then draft 1 was to create that map. And as David mentioned, the reception was lukewarm, if not cold, from the 3GPP, probably because our draft was not very clear on its intent. What we were doing was creating a structure or a translation structure, but we were not very clear saying that this is not a sort of a teaching exercise for the 3GPP folks to know how they should translate their QCI into DiffServ, or how they should, use this draft to map the QCI, getting DiffServ marking. That was fairly unclear. In fact, the draft itself was not clear on any of those framework environments. Also, we didn't say if it was supposed to be something that could be suggested as a possibility and would be in the informational track, or if that would be a standard track, making it mandatory every time that would happen. So the reception was cold, and we understood very well why. So we worked on draft number 2, where we tried to make the context much clearer. And of course, we were intending to present that at a past IETF. That didn't happen in the face-to-face. And also, we had a third contributor that joined us, who helped us also add some recommendations for 5G QoS elements, which are the QFI and 5QIs, based, for example, on the TS23501. Next slide, please. So here we are today with a set of possible recommendations, which are clearly qualified as being informational. We do not need to force this on anyone, but because we have multiple enterprises that implement with us, either through the common NHEL vendors, or through their own negotiation with NHEL vendors, those dual connections. And as we see this as growing permanently, we would like to offer the community a common way of seeing those mapping possibilities, so that when they receive a QCI from the 5G or LTE link, they have an idea of how they would be treating the traffic going through the DiffServ domain, to try to match some intent which would be close, if not entirely identical, because I don't think it is entirely possible, but at least close in intent to what they will be receiving from the carrier side. So at this point, what we would love to see is people, looking into this draft, providing comment first on whether this framework that we specified is clear enough to show that we're not, dictating any mapping to anyone, and certainly not, talking to 3GPP, asking them to do work, but also help us see if the mapping we propose makes sense or not. In particular, you will see, if you take the time to read this, that some of the maps are asymmetric, which means that we have one DSCP that clearly maps the intent of a QFI, but when we go the other direction, we couldn't find the same intent on the way back. So we have a bucket that falls well, but that bucket doesn't really fit the pipe to go the other direction. So we do have some cases where we have asymmetry in the mapping. It seems to us, when the folks in my company working in the 3GPP who are more versed than I am into the 3GPP logic behind this QFI QCI, that this is unavoidable. But intellectually, this is not very satisfying, because we have this impression that things are not, the pipe doesn't have the same structure in both directions. So we would also love to get feedback on those, to see if anyone has issues with that asymmetry, if anyone has some recommendations on how these asymmetries would be solved if they need to be solved. And that's pretty much where we are.
think there's a comment from Jake Holland in the mic queue.
Yeah. Hi. Have you considered trying to make it dynamic? I asked because I happened on a draft here. I will, since we have such a handy chat, I will paste it in the chat log here and also add it to the notes. I don't know if you will like this idea, and I haven't read your draft with the mapping yet, but there has been an effort active for some time to make a way to communicate such services across domain boundaries and to negotiate a marking for them at that boundary. So I would encourage you to maybe take a look and consider whether there's a way to do it that way. If the issue is that they don't like, yeah, all right. Thanks.
Go ahead, sorry. Oh, okay. Thank you, Jacob. Yeah, I will definitely. I know that 3GPP supports RC 2414. So there is this notion of DSCP that can be carried within the traffic. However, I also know that a choice of the QCI, QFI is a carrier choice, based on SLA. So there is not always a direct mapping between what the UE could be marking as DSCP with what the carrier would be allocating as QFI, QCI. But there's maybe definitely a way maybe to carry that information across domain. So I'll read that draft carefully. Thank you.
I guess the chairs would be interested in feedback about whether you think the BGP community for QoS marking draft in some way touches on what you're doing, even if you are choosing a different approach, because we should liaise with these people in the IETF if they're doing something at least a little bit similar.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, just interested to know what you think about that.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? I see Spencer in line.
Could you back up to the picture that had the network diagram on it?
That should be slide 2, I think.
I can start talking. It seemed like to me that one of the things I wondered about when I saw this was when you're talking about 3GPP with home networks and visited networks and transit networks. Is it your feeling that you may be going through a few of these unlicensed network path legs? Yeah, that one. Thank you. You see what I'm saying?
You mean controlled by different entities? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah.
It may happen. Yeah, it's probably not the most common case we are facing.
Sure.
But
sure.
It may happen. Sure. Yes.
As people are doing what's the 3GPP thing where you are dropping local, diverting local traffic onto a LAN or something like that, whatever that's called. That you may be hitting a few different unlicensed path segments, not just one. So I think that encourages. I like this draft when it came out, which is doesn't matter to anything. But I think that if it's the case that different unlicensed path links may be using different markings without any guidance at all, I think that argues a bit more that moving this forward is a good thing to do, because you know, you're kind of losing fidelity with you know, the intended quality of experience. And you know, every time you're doing a hop, and so if those things are not consistent, it seems like you'd be less likely to do something helpful. You know, I can kind of leave that there for the minutes, but I did want to ask how stable you expect this document to be. I read this draft before the 5G quality mechanisms were added. So I was just kind of thinking, oh, well, this would be, you know, we would publish this as an RFC and kind of be finished for a while. But do you expect that, you know, they've been using QCI for a while, but, you know, is this something that we're going to need to revisit every few years?
Yeah, I think, thank you, Sensor. I think you have a great point. I was hoping to to be done with the QCI. Of course, you know, the IMT 2020 started, you know, looking at the 5G a few years ago, and it seems that our 3 GPP friends have a 10-year cycle. So, but you know, they're also very dynamic. So I'm expecting, exactly to your point, that we may have a stable draft to which we may have to add, you know, some, you know, updates for 6G or traffic, you know, that can come as critical for the evolution of 5G. So yeah, I'm anticipating there will be a stable foundation and then a need for updates. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so, but I mean, if you're talking a 10-year cycle, that's different from a 2-year cycle. So, you know, that kind of goes to my next thing that I wanted to be sure and say, which was, it seemed like to me that publishing this as an RFC would be a good thing to do, because again, the intended audience isn't just people who are running 3GPP networks, you know, and if they're using, you know, if everybody is marking the same on the unlicensed links, that might be a helpful thing to do too. So, you know, I mean, this is an informational draft, and, you know, it doesn't have any more standing than anybody else who is doing diffserv, you know, and saying that these are the code points you should be using. But I think that if work in this space is useful, it would be useful. It would be useful to more people than just the network providers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next in line is Sabir.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sabir.
Okay, Jeremy, thanks for the update. I will actually start with the same slide you have, what Venture mentioned. But there could be a scenario that although UE is connecting through Wi-Fi, it's still going through the same operator's network. Correct?
Sure. Yes.
So do you anticipate in that case, or any recommendation, I have not checked your updated draft, any recommendation that that scenario should use the same marking what the operator use for the other link? Because that's a clear distinction, because if it is managed by the same operator, right, or configured by the operator, they may not use a different kinds of a scheme, as you are saying here that this UE is completely managed by the enterprise cloud and it is configured by the enterprise cloud.
Yeah, thank you, Subir. You know, my general thinking is that carriers know what they're doing. So if they're in control of both links, you know, they are perfectly capable without any draft from our side to decide if they want to prioritize one of the paths or if they want to treat equally both paths. And in which case, you know, they will apply whatever marking they think is relevant to make that those two paths equivalent. So, you know, this is not typically a case where this draft would be useful. I would see this draft more useful when an enterprise has an SLA negotiation and dialogue with a carrier at the end of which they have a view of what QCR or QFI would be used, and they would be in control of the other link. And what they would like to do is to align the other link to the 3GPP treatment. If it's a one entity controlling both, they can do like we say in RC 4594, they're in full control, so they can do whatever they want, and they don't need any guidance from anyone.
So I will check that your updated draft. But do you think that the draft should make this clear? Because that would confuse that scenario.
Clear? Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. So I think it is clear, but please tell me if you think it is not. In which case, I'll add more words to make it clear.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think you're next.
Yeah, just a quick note. The table on page 14 seems to be in a very difficult layout. So you might want to look at that.
I will, thank you. Page 14, you said, right?
Page 14, the table. It looks awful.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Something happened that these tables didn't like. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll fix that.
David, you're next. Thank you.
I'm going to go say a couple of things. First is process-wise. Historically, RFC 4594 started out as informational. It was unclear how widely we adopted. If we were to revise and update 4594, it has been sufficiently widely adopted that it would likely be issued as a best current practice. And that would be a plausible path forward for this document. Issue it as informational. If it goes into widespread use and proves useful in its context comparably to 4594, then perhaps it has the opportunity to become a BCP down the line. I think this is digging in the right place. The other thing I was going to mention is there's a use case related to the one Subir was talking about, where a cellular operator offers what amounts of cellular service over the internet, which may wind up going Wi-Fi into the client device, the phone.
Yes. Agreed. Thank you. Yep.
Great.
And Greg, quiet.
Thanks.
Can I make one more comment?
Sophia, can you follow Greg?
Yes. Can I just add one more comment, Jeremy?
I think you're right after Greg, if you don't mind.
Oh, I see. Okay. Go ahead, please. Sorry.
Thank you.
All right. So this is actually the first time I've taken a look at this draft, and I had a question on section 6, IANA considerations. It indicates that the document is allocating 14 district code points. It also describes them as being pool 1 code points. I would point out that only one of them actually is a pool 1 code point. The other 13 code points, 6 of them are pool 2, which are for local use, and 7 of them are pool 3. I guess the main question is, am I understanding this correctly, that this draft is proposing that IANA assign these 14 code points for the specific purposes identified here, and that they are then allocated for that use globally?
That is our suggestion. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, that's a significant chunk of the available standardization space, as well as a significant chunk of the local use space, which is not under the IANA control line.
Yes. Thank you for the IANA note. I'll check the pool definition. And yes, you're right. Yes. And there are so many flows that are defined in 3GPP that TSVWG has not defined in RFC 4594 or others, that yeah, we came to the conclusion that there's a big gap to fill. Yes, indeed.
There are other potential uses of that code point space. In particular, the NQB draft is defining one that conflicts with, or is requesting one that conflicts with one that's being requested here as well. So.
Sure, the chairs have noted that. I'll also note as a chair on this that we don't normally allocate large numbers of DSCPs to people in RFCs. They're more a conserved resource that we expect people to work it out. So we will need to revisit the number of code points and how we deal with it. But the first point of action for you probably is to check IANA and to check the current status.
Yes, will do. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Which brings us to Beer.
Thanks.
Sorry for pausing you. Go ahead.
One of the points Greg mentioned, I forgot to mention that is one of the very critical point that needs a greater review. I would also like to add the other organization with our experience, like ETAS, which is the American Telecom Standards. They also in their specification use some of the mapping, which is not even, of course, registered with the IANA. So the history of 3GPP also, the way they have defined, they provided the flexibility for the operators to do their in their own network when they are not interoperating with others, right? So assigning this the code points, the IANA, and then globally used, we have to be a little bit careful and make sure that okay, what other standards are not using and they are not recommending in their specification, which we believe would be a difficult task for us to do. And that's the reason our understanding is that 3GPP gave that way and gave the operators and the service provider flexibility to do the mapping in such a way so that they do not cause any problem with other networks.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. And this work is going to be coordinated with 3GPP if we do go ahead. We're certainly not going to start specifying things that impact anyone else's use of technology. Spencer's next in line. Spencer.
Hang on, one quick. Sabir, were you intending to suggest that we also coordinate with an additional standards org beyond 3GPP?
One of the things in our understanding is ETAS.
Could you type the name of that standards org and a web link for it into the chat or the Etherpad so that we don't have a transcription problem?
Yeah, I will do that. ETAS is that, that's American Telecom Standards with all the operators and the vendors join there. And I'll send that link later on. And there are also certain other services like there are a lot of priority services which are also mapped in the network, and it's a country specific, and those things I think we should be really consulting and make sure that we are not overlapping that with other code points and how they are using it in their network.
And there's GSMA specs and probably other ones as well that we would have to touch on if we did work in this space.
Yes.
So if I may note on that, Subir, thank you. And I think that there are two different types of organizations logics. One is where vendors like carriers, for example, interoperate with each other within their respective domains. And I think IR34 and the that you're referring are working towards that goal. And another one is when traffic leaves their domain to be sent back to DeepServe, which is the domain where we are concerned here, because we're not within carrier exchanges here. We are leaving the carrier domain, and we try to have a parallel path that has the same value. And it seems that these organizations have not treated that case. IR34, by the way, is very limited to a certain number of subset of essential traffic types, but has not expanded into all the QSI, CI and QFI, precisely because, as you say, carriers are big guys. They know what they're doing, so they can interrupt with each other without guidance. It's when we leave that domain that this problem we face appears. But yeah, I agree with you. We need to double check the framework that they are defining, if it's the context of the interoperator or if it's outside of their domain.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you have actually pointed out correctly. So that is, remember that early on we mentioned about that if it is clearly specifying that these are the use cases it is referring to, right? And what Greg mentioned, that in this draft you are asking for a large number of INA code points which are aim is the universally interoperable, right? So that's what I'm mentioning, that we have to be careful and get a good review from every organization, see if there are, right? And I will also look at that, some of these ETA's recommendation, and I can offline mention to you that what, if there isn't some of the issues. But as in the working group, I think we should be careful before we assign them. And I think Chair's already pointed out that.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
That puts Martin in the queue, I think.
Yeah, just following up on Greg's comment, are we actually, I guess I'm confused, are we actually assigning new DSCPs, or are we just using existing DSCPs and mapping them to 3GPP behaviors?
So in this draft, we do both. We try to map to existing DSCPs as much as possible, but we also conclude that some traffic types defined by 3GPP just don't have any equivalent in RFC 4594 or any other defining traffic types. And then we conclude that the new DSCP would be needed if we wanted to translate the same intent on the served domain.
This is David. I think a conclusion the new one would be needed is fine. I think going ahead and allocating the new one takes it significantly further and might not be a good thing to do.
Right. Understood. Yep.
It is certainly something which would require quite a lot of discussion. So I'm going to let other people talk, and then I think we'll say something at the end to try and tidy up. Martin's still in the queue, I think. Martin, do you want to be in the queue?
No, there was a net one, a queue in there, and I just used it.
That's fine. You can always put yourself in the queue. That's your privilege. Spencer, are you meant to be in the queue?
Also meant to be unmuted, sorry. Just to make sure that we're not telling the authors to bring us a rock and then they bring us another rock and that's still the wrong rock. And can we give any guidance for what the definition of a non-large number would be for the authors? It doesn't have to be now, but
Actually, Spencer, this is even easier. This is not going to be a standards track document. Therefore, it cannot allocate DSCPs full stop. That suggests that the right thing for the authors to do is to suggest places where new DSCPs would be useful and write separate contained docs to allocate them based on individual use.
So the informational draft is the guidance, and it's informational, and that when it matters, the standards track documents are the ones that allocate one or two.
Yeah, the standard tracks documents will be parallels to the NQB PHB draft that Greg is working on.
Right. So
that's the right structure going forward.
You were coming at this a different way than I was, and a better way, which surprises no one. Thank you.
So if I can try and summarize a little bit where I think we've got and see if people agree. This whole idea of doing work in this space was presented to the working group. A draft was written. People have talked about it. I'll talk more today. Clearly, this sort of work requires various pieces of expertise. It requires expertise in understanding how the technology works. It requires expertise in understanding how vendors and other standards bodies are using that technology. And it will also require some standardization decisions if we're going to specify anything new. This is quite a big thing to start, so I don't think the working group will actually start any of that activity yet. But I'm hugely interested in discussion about this and in making progress in the right direction, because if people are not arguing, I think we're heading in a good place. David, do you want to add anything?
I would simply reinforce the themes we've been running throughout this, that careful coordination with at least 3GPP is going to be essential here. I don't think that's news to anybody.
Okay, right. So please comment on the draft. Please, Jerome, would you revise this and bring it back again? Because I think there is interest in looking at what it contains. And talk to us about how to make this go forward in some way. Does that seem fair enough?
Fair enough. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
It looks like we don't have any of the 3GPP people that we've been talking to about this draft on this call, so we're probably going to have to make take proactive measures, reach out and get their input.
Oh yeah,
I will do that too. Yes.
Yeah. Martin, do you need to be in the loop on that? You probably do.
Yeah, probably. I would ask the chairs, do we think, I mean, we can do the informational draft without biting off the standards bit immediately. Do the chairs believe that the level of work in just getting this informational draft to the happy place is prohibitive at this time?
I think we need to see another rev before we can actually make that call, because we were so pleased that people were throwing poison darts at this and firing fireballs. So yeah, the chairs would like to see another revision. And Jerome, you got some feedback, so I think you know some of the things to do in that. And in the meantime, we will touch base with the 3GPP liaison in the IETF just to make sure that they now think this is not really horrible, because they thought it was really horrible actually when we started, but they didn't understand quite what was being proposed.
As the likely responsible working group chair for this draft, I think we want to see the new version first, because I think we need to remove the implication that this draft will allocate DSCPs before going back to 3GPP on this.
Sounds good. I'll take care of that very soon.
Thank you, Jerome.
Thank you.
Thank you for putting up with this. I think you knew you were stepping into an interesting space when you've got these two fairly sizable standards communities involved.
Yes, I was expecting wind. I'm happy it blows because this is needed. Thank you.
All right, I think we should be looking to wrapping up this meeting, as I'm pretty sure I see at least one participant from Asia in the call where it's something like midnight or worse.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. Is there anybody who wants to come to the queue and say anything before we close this session? Is there anything that you think we should know about that we haven't yet covered? Well, in that case, thank you ever so much for participating. Personally, I would rather have gone to Vancouver, but wherever you are, I wish that you stay well, you you get better if you need to get better, and thank you for your participation. We will follow up this meeting via the email list. Please use the email list, and we will have another interim later this month. But until then, goodbye.
Thank you very much, everybody, for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thanks.